Why is everyone leaving Chicago? I'm sure most of you already have an idea swirling around in your head, and no, it's not in the back of a coroner's van as often as you think. Chicago's one of a handful of major cities predicted to lose more population over the next decade. There are a multitude of reasons people are flooding out of Chicago. Some are obvious and some aren't as obvious. Chicago's lost population in 5 of the last 7 decades, and it's predicted that they'll lose about 3% in the 2030 census. Today, we're going to find out what's chasing people out of the Windy City. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. Number 10, the suburban flight. Many people who live in Chicago have moved to the suburbs in recent years. This is actually starting to be a trend going on all around the United States. At the 2020 census, Chicago had gained 1.9%, but in 2020 alone, the population of Chicago had declined by 2.6%, while the population of the suburbs surrounding Chicago grew by 1.4%. This obviously is due to several factors, including the desire for a more peaceful, family-friendly environment, as well as the availability of more affordable housing in the suburbs. Whether it's a good city or not, it's always going to be more expensive in the city compared to the suburbs. Unless you're in like some painfully wealthy suburb, then yeah, that's a different story. But it's like this, it's almost like a lung, The city breathes in, people come live in the city, then all the oxygen gets sucked out and it breathes out and everyone heads to the suburbs. That's what happened after World War II, and I think it's kind of happening again. The suburbs are expanding while the cities are shrinking. Number 9, climate change. Yes, believe it or not, way out here in the Midwest, climate change is affecting things. Chicago is facing a number of challenges related to climate change, including rising sea levels. Now, there is no sea there, but there are giant lakes there, and this will affect that too. They'll also receive more extreme weather events and the decline in air quality. These challenges are going to make it more difficult to live in the city and leading some people to move away, again, to the suburbs or to other states. I think it was last year, it was 2020, Chicago had a horrible heat wave that killed like 12 people. Then if you've ever been in Chicago in the winter, that could be pretty brutal too. The climate change is just going to get people to move away from the lake, which Chicago lives on one of the largest lakes on the planet, Lake Michigan. I'm sure if you're from the United States, you already know that, or Canada. If you're from someplace else, maybe you don't know that. Number 8, the disinvestment. Many parts of Chicago have been disinvested in, leading to a lack of resources and opportunities. This has made it difficult for some people to live in the city. In 2020, the city of Chicago had a $1.2 billion deficit. I've seen other reports that said it was more than that. I've seen some that say it was lower than that. I don't know. Anyway, that's what the official thing is, $1.2 billion. This, as you can imagine, has led to cuts in services such as education, healthcare, and public safety. Chicago has a number of infrastructure problems along with that, including crumbling roads and bridges. In 2021, the city of Chicago had a backlog of $20 billion in infrastructure repairs, meaning they had orders for things, they just hadn't got to them or they didn't have the money for them. Number 7, poor public schools. The public schools in Chicago are not as good as they could be. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with the budget problems. In 2021, only 37% of the students in Chicago public schools met or exceeded state standards in reading, and only 34% met or exceeded state standards in math. This, of course, chases people out of the city, too. When you're a parent and this is what your kids are dealing with, you leave. You go to the suburbs. Now, of course, those numbers for where they were on math and stuff, you see different numbers from different organizations for those things. So I always like to bring that up because when I do the research, I see different stats all the time. The school districts are going to give you one stat, and then some private organization is going to give you some other stat. Then, of course, you're going to have people in the comment section apparently have some connection with the right stats, and they're going to give theirs. It's a mess. Number 6, lack of jobs. Chicago's lost a significant number of jobs in recent years due to the decline in manufacturing and other industries, and they've lost a lot of jobs from people that are remote working. Technically, the job is still in Chicago, but the remote worker has moved out of the city, so that money that they get paid isn't going back into the local economy. They're down in Terre Haute, Indiana, trying to save some money and buy a house, but their job is technically in Chicago. I'm just kidding. It wouldn't be Terre Haute, Indiana. Nobody moves there. It would probably be Fort Wayne, Indiana. In 2020, 2022, the unemployment rate in Chicago was 4.9%, which was higher than the national average of 3.3%. Now, at one point during the pandemic when everything was going crazy, Chicago's unemployment rate one month was like 9.5%, while the rest of the country was like 6.5. 6.5 is really high, but 9 is insane. This, as you can imagine, during the pandemic, it made it really hard for people to find jobs. I went there during the pandemic, I think late 2020 in Chicago. Nothing was open. I sat in the hotel room and got room service. I also talked to what I believe was an inebriated clergyman. Number 5, taxes. Taxes in Chicago are pretty brutal. I mean, the state of Illinois already has some pretty high taxes, but when you rank the cities, the major cities in the United States, Chicago comes in number 6th. You want to hear what's scary? You know who has higher taxes than Chicago? Number 5, Milwaukee. Okay, Milwaukee's decent for a major city. It's got some crimes, not a big deal. Baltimore's a freaking nightmare. It's at number 4. Newark, New Jersey, which I always encourage people to steer clear of there. They come at number 3, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Detroit, Michigan. The absolute worst city in the nation by most people's accounts. It's number 1 when it comes to city taxes. But Chicago's are pretty bad, especially when you consider they're in Illinois. Of all the 50 states, Illinois is ranked 7th for the highest taxes. The taxes have not only chased out individuals, but a lot of businesses have left because of the taxes. Now, this is going on all around the country, so it's not, just happening in Chicago, but it's pretty bad in Chicago. You lose businesses, you lose jobs, less people paying taxes. It's a snowball effect. Number 4, a high crime rate. Right now, a bunch of people are just like, WTF, Briggs, what's going on here? They're the worst. They're the absolute worst. I saw it on the news. Chicago's horrible. Chicago's really not that bad. Not because they don't have a lot of crime going on. They do. They also have a lot of shootings and a lot of murders. I mean, the number of murders they get, that's one thing they truly excel at. It's almost like they're trying to win a competition or something like that. Wow, that was a little dark. Should probably change that. Nah. Moving on. But because of the large population, their rate is kind of low compared to other cities. It's still bad. I'm not saying it's a wonderland and Alice and the Mad Hatter live there and it's just great and the Cheshire Cat and everything's a big garden. No, it's definitely a nightmare, but it's not one of the worst in the country. It's actually 22nd in 2022 for violent crime rate. I had a mathematician from a YouTube video that focused on math, Bry the Math Guy. He actually made me a video to help people understand that because people just couldn't understand it. The violent crime rate in Chicago is 143% above the national average. In comparison, St. Louis is 283% above the national average. Detroit is 455% above the national average. So Chicago does have a high crime rate. They have a lot of crime. It's just not as, high as they make it sound in the news. However you explain it, it's still chasing people out of the city. Number 3, reputation. Chicago has a bad reputation. I mean, it's obvious. It's in the news all the time. Some of it's deserved, most of it's exaggerated. As we just talked about, crime is on the news or every other media thing about Chicago, and they make it sound like it's this bombed out wasteland that only Mad Max could flourish in. If you've been to Chicago or you live in Chicago, you know the city's fine. It just has some places that are a little rough. This reputation doesn't really affect people leaving. I mean, they're leaving for other reasons, but it stops people from moving in. I'm sure thousands of people every single year get a job offer or something like that, and they're offered to move to Chicago without knowing anything. They're going to scratch Chicago off their list because they've seen the reports, and they're blown out of proportion. Now, don't get me wrong. Chicago does have a lot of crime, does have a lot of violent crime, but not as bad as they make it sound. Number 2, poverty. Chicago has a significant amount of poverty. In 2020, the poverty rate in Chicago was 23.4%, which is higher than the national average of about 10.5 in 2020. Right now, it's about 22.3%. So they've gotten a little better since 2020, but it's still pretty bad. The national average right now is about 11%. Of course, when you have poverty, this leads to a number of other problems like crime, obviously unemployment, poor health, lack of education. When people are poor and they really can't afford much of anything, their kids don't make it to school a lot of the time. If you've ever been to Chicago, you know a lot of their crime and a lot of their poverty is happening on the south side of Chicago. A vast majority of the city is decent for a major city, but the south side is where most of the things you don't want to be involved in, poverty, crime, people stealing recyclables from each other, that's all going on in the south side. All right, before we get to number 1, don't forget we have another channel called On This Day. There's a link down below. Head on over there and subscribe. All right, on to number 1. And number 1, the high cost of living. The high cost of living is brutal there. I mean, we already talked about the taxes, but just daily expenses are pretty high in Chicago. Then when you look at the real estate, you kind of want to sob a little bit. Now, just so I'm clear, that's expensive for the Midwest. If this was on the West Coast or the East Coast, like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose, or even Miami, the prices in Chicago are not terrible. Right now, the median home price is about $340,000. It's just about the national average. Almost every other major city in the Midwest is well below the national average. So that's the first hurdle. Then when you look at the cost of living index, which goes like this, let's say the cost of living 100 is the average. The middle city, that's what the average is. In this case, it's Oklahoma City. If you go to a grocery store or any store and buy $100 worth whatever, I don't know, V8s and Cinnabons. So you buy $100 of that in Oklahoma City. That same cart of Cinnabon and Clamatos, $119 in Chicago. So is Chicago the most expensive city in the United States? No, not really. It's up there. It's definitely not as expensive. But for the Midwest, it's pretty expensive. And for the people living there, it's terribly expensive. And that's why they're leaving, or at least one of the reasons they're leaving. Now, when it comes to real estate prices, one thing I should mention, they have such run down areas. It really brings down their average and their median prices. If you were to eliminate the South Side Chicago, the median home price there, it's kind of an estimate, but it would probably be closer to $560,000. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Now go out, have a great day, and be nice to each other.